A desperate mother bear paces frantically at the edge of a clearing, making sounds unlike anything veteran ranger Mike Patterson had heard in 15 years. Breaking every rule of wildlife behavior, she deliberately catches his eye and seems to beckon him forward. Against all his training and instincts, Mike decides to follow the distraught animal step by cautious step into the silent forest. The sight waiting in the shadowy ravine leaves him completely frozen in shock. If you'd like to hear more stories like this one, consider subscribing and turning on notifications. The morning mist clung to the ancient pines of Blackwood National Park as Mike Patterson shouldered his pack and began his daily patrol. 15 years as a forest ranger had taught him the rhythms of these woods, but the last 12 months had changed everything. His colleagues now called him the Ghost Ranger, the man who volunteered for the most isolated routes, who spoke little, and whose eyes seemed fixed on something distant. It had been exactly 1 year since the helicopter crash. 1 year since Mike had watched helplessly as flames engulfed the aircraft, carrying his partner during what should have been a routine wildfire evacuation. The memory still visited him each night, which explained why he preferred the company of silent trees to sympathetic colleagues. This autumn morning started like any other solo patrol through the eastern ridge. Mike checked his equipment, adjusted his ranger hat, and ventured into the wilderness that had become both his refuge and his prison. The elevation brought a chill to the air, and his breath formed small clouds as he hiked deeper into the less traveled regions of the park. Something felt different today. Mike paused, his senses suddenly alert. The forest was unnaturally quiet. No bird song, no rustling of small creatures in the underbrush. After 15 years, he knew what normal silence felt like. This wasn't it. This silence felt weighted, like the forest itself was holding its breath. Mike reached for his binoculars and scanned the tree line. At first, nothing seemed amiss. Then movement caught his eye near the edge of a clearing about 100 yards ahead. A female black bear paced back and forth, her movements jerky and agitated. Bears weren't uncommon in this part of the park, but something about her behavior raised the hairs on the back of his neck. The bear rose suddenly onto her hind legs, swaying slightly as she faced directly in his direction. It was then that he heard it, a sound unlike any he'd encountered in all his years in the wilderness. Not a growl or roar, but something that struck a chord deep within him. It sounded almost like crying, a keening, plaintive sound that echoed through the silent forest. Mike lowered his binoculars, his hands trembling slightly. Every wildlife training course, every ranger guidebook, every survival instructor had ingrained one fundamental rule: predators retreat from humans unless threatened or protecting young. Yet this mother bear was deliberately trying to get his attention, meeting his gaze across the distance in a way that sent shivers down his spine. He whispered to himself that this was insane as cold sweat formed on his brow, despite the morning chill. His training told him to maintain distance, to back away slowly. Instead, he found himself reaching for his radio. Mike reported his position to headquarters, his voice steadier than he felt. He explained that he was tracking unusual bear behavior, but omitted the strange feeling that the animal was calling to him specifically. Even in his own ears, that would have sounded ridiculous. Against all protocol and 15 years of experience, Mike began moving toward the bear's location. He kept his tranquilizer gun ready, though something told him he wouldn't need it. The mother bear, seeing him approach, dropped to all fours and moved a few yards before looking back at him, almost as if checking that he was following. Mike's heartbeat thundered in his ears. This behavior contradicted everything he knew about black bears. They were supposed to flee human contact, not initiate it. As a ranger, he'd spent years teaching visitors how to avoid bear encounters. Yet here he was, deliberately following one into the forest. The bear led him toward a steep ravine, her movements becoming increasingly frantic. She circled a massive pile of storm debris, fallen branches, and a large tree limb brought down during last week's thunderstorm. She pawed at the wreckage, making those same haunting sounds that had first caught his attention. Then Mike heard it, a weak, pitiful cry coming from beneath the fallen tree. A cub. The situation suddenly made sense. The mother wasn't trying to lure him for an attack. She was desperate for help. Time slowed as Mike processed his options. Approaching a mother bear with a threatened cub, violated every safety protocol in the Ranger Handbook. Bears were most dangerous when their young were in danger. Yet this mother had deliberately sought human help, an unprecedented behavior that defied explanation. Something deeper than training, perhaps the same protective instinct that had drawn him to becoming a ranger in the first place, pushed him forward. Moving cautiously, speaking in low, calm tones, Mike approached the debris pile. The mother bear backed up slightly, but her eyes never left him. She made no threatening movements, no sounds of aggression. She simply watched, her eyes holding an intelligence and desperation that shook Mike to his core. The cub's condition was worse than he had feared. Its tiny body was partially crushed beneath a heavy tree limb, blood matting its dark fur. Its breathing came in shallow, labored gasps. Mike knew he had to act quickly or the young bear wouldn't survive. As he began carefully removing smaller branches to access the trapped cub, Mike felt the mother bear's presence just feet away. He could sense her warm breath, smell her wild scent. Every instinct screamed danger, but her behavior remained calm, almost trusting. She seemed to understand he was trying to help. The work was painstaking. One wrong move could further injure the cub or trigger the mother's protective instincts. 20 agonizing minutes passed as Mike carefully shifted debris and finally managed to lift the tree limb just enough to free the small creature. The cub lay motionless, except for the slight rise and fall of its chest. Mike gently cradled the injured animal, assessing the damage. Multiple lacerations, possible internal injuries, severe weakness. The prognosis wasn't good. As he examined the cub's wounded paw, something caught his eye, a strange glint of metal embedded in the flesh. Mike carefully brushed away blood and fur, revealing something that made his blood run cold. What he discovered wasn't debris or a random injury. It was a sophisticated electronic tracking device, professionally implanted into the cub's paw. His ranger training immediately recognized this wasn't part of any authorized research program. The park only used external ear tags for wildlife monitoring, never surgically implanted devices, and certainly never on cubs this young. His mind raced through the possibilities, each more disturbing than the last. The implications crystallized with horrifying clarity. Someone was tracking bear families to later return and capture cubs for trafficking. And given the surgical precision of the implant, this wasn't the work of amateur poachers. It had to involve someone with specialized knowledge, someone from within the Park Service itself. For the first time in a year, Mike felt something break through his fog of grief, a cold, clarifying anger. He carefully wrapped the cub in his jacket and reached for his radio again. This time, he requested an emergency evacuation team with veterinary support. He kept his suspicions to himself. Until he knew who was involved, he couldn't trust anyone. The mother bear followed at a distance as Mike carried her cub to a clearing where a medical transport could land. Her trust in him never wavered, defying everything science knew about bear behavior. Perhaps desperation had overwhelmed even her most primal instincts. In the weeks that followed, Mike conducted a quiet, methodical investigation. He documented the tracking device and began monitoring staff movements, particularly those with access to veterinary supplies and surgical equipment. The cub, meanwhile, received intensive care at the park's Wildlife Rehabilitation Center, its condition gradually improving. Mike's breakthrough came when he discovered irregularities in the supply logs, surgical equipment and sedatives that had been requisitioned but never recorded in official research projects. The trail led directly to James Harlow, the park's deputy director, a man who had built his reputation on conservation advocacy. Working with federal wildlife agents, Mike set up surveillance operations that quickly yielded results. 3 weeks after finding the injured cub, they arrested Harlow and 3 accomplices as they attempted to sedate and capture cubs from another bear family in the northern section of the park. The evidence was overwhelming. Documents recovered from Harlow's home revealed connections to an international wildlife trafficking ring that sold bear cubs to exotic pet markets in Asia for upwards of $50,000 each. The operation had been running for years, with dozens of cubs smuggled out of the country. Justice came swiftly. Harlow received a 15-year prison sentence, with the judge declaring that those entrusted with protecting natural heritage who choose to exploit it deserve the harshest punishment. The other conspirators received similar sentences. 6 months after that strange autumn morning, Mike stood at the edge of the eastern ridge, watching as the rehabilitated cub and its mother were released back into the wild. The young bear had made a remarkable recovery, all traces of its ordeal visible only in a slight limp and the scar where the tracking device had been removed. As the bears disappeared into the dense forest, Mike reflected on the extraordinary chain of events. A mother bear, driven by desperation to trust a human, the very species she had been conditioned to fear, had not only saved her cub, but had exposed a criminal enterprise and reminded a grief-stricken ranger of his purpose. Sometimes, Mike thought, as he turned back toward the ranger station, it takes an animal to remind us of our own humanity. And sometimes trust comes from the most unexpected places, even when all logic says it shouldn't. What would you do if a wild animal seemed to be asking for your help? Would you follow your training, or would you, like Mike, follow your instincts instead?